were all very freaked out, in the 20th century about overpopulation and how, the world, it was going to cause this mass starvation and all this stuff. You had all this doomsaying about all the things that were going to happen. And it turned out for lots of different reasons that was not the case. But it's gone, quite a bit now below replacement fertility. And I think that's what started to freak people out.
Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Eric Cohn, executive producer. It's 2007. Spider-Man 3 is the top-grossing film at the box office. Beyonce's Irreplaceable is the biggest hit song. American Idol is the most-watched TV show. 2007 was also the last time that the United States was at replacement-level fertility, which is 2.1 children born per woman. In the years following, through the ups and downs of the Great Recession, the 2016 election, and the COVID-19 pandemic, the rate has fallen to 1.66 children per woman. When you zoom out, you'll see that the American birth rates have been falling for decades. But this is far from a phenomenon isolated to the United States. In 2020, the fertility rate in the UK was 1.6. In Germany, it was 1.5. Finland, 1.4, Denmark and Sweden, 1.7, and in South Korea, a shocking 0.81. In response to these long-run trends, some have advocated pro-natalist governmental policies to incentivize more reproduction, or at least to smooth the way for people who want to have more kids. But are these policies effective? Elizabeth Nolan Brown, senior editor at Reason Magazine, says no. In the cover story for the June 2023 issue of Reason, Brown surveys the flagging international reproductive landscape and the government policies that have been enacted to address that problem. In the end, she advocates, at a minimum, not panicking. Today, I talked to Elizabeth Nolan Brown about falling birth rates, failing pro-natalist policies, and how we should think about a world where fewer and fewer people are expecting. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/actonline. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Elizabeth Nolan Brown, welcome to Acton Line.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So your essay, the cover story in the June 2023 issue of Reason, is entitled Storks Don't Take Orders from the State, Falling Birth Rates, Pro-Natalist Policies, and the Limits of Population Control. So you start out in the beginning really talking about diagnosing the problem, which has been declining birth rates over time. Why don't you lay out the landscape as you see it? What has been happening to not just here in the United States to birth rates, but what has been happening around the world? As you did a survey of all of this, what did you discover?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how many countries around the world are experiencing declining birth rates. There are a few, about more than half of countries are, according to the latest data, which comes from 2020. A lot of countries in Africa are not. There are some countries in the Middle East that are not, but for the most part, throughout the Americas, and throughout Europe and throughout Asia, we've seen declining birth rates. And 2.1 is replacement level fertility, the amount of fertility, the amount of children needed that each woman needs to have in order to stave off population decline. And very few countries now are above replacement level for fertility in Europe and the United States. And even Latin America and places like that are starting to get closer and closer to replacement level fertility and have seen massive declines over the past few decades.
Do we have any idea, or is there any consensus out there on why this is happening? Because as you noted, it's happening in places that are really very, very different. The two areas of the world that you noted, Africa and the Middle East, perhaps we could point to, a lot of predominantly Muslim countries, and maybe that there's something with that. Is there any consensus or idea on why this is happening? Because again, it's the decline we can see really going back a while now. I believe like early 1900s is when it really starts to decline, and there are peaks and valleys throughout there, but the trajectory has been downward.
Yeah, and that's what's really interesting is because people have a lot of pet theories about why this decline is happening. Just on the right, you get a lot of arguments that involve culture, not valuing motherhood, just too much liberalism, feminism, things like that. On the left, you get a lot of arguments that involve not having a strong social safety net. And, we need more benefits for parents. We need more government subsidies for childcare, things like that. But none of these explanations that are popular in the United States, at least, really pan out when you look around the world, because you can look at, like you said, countries that have vastly different cultures, political systems, economic systems, like cultural climates in terms of what they value. And they're all experiencing this sort of decline. The thing that ties together the countries that aren't is that they are generally very poor or very repressive. So they've completely, outlawed, birth control or sort of any means to control fertility. So it seems like pretty much anytime you give people the option to have fewer children, they are taking it, and the technological means to avoid having a ton of children, they are taking it. It is important to note, though, that I think is also kind of goes against the narrative, is that at least in the United States, isn't being driven by a decline or by an increase in childlessness primarily. We're around historic levels, or at least, levels of the past 150 years for the percentage of people that have zero children. It's primarily driven by families, people that have children, having fewer children in the past. So we're seeing a lot more 1 and 2 child families and a lot fewer 4+ child families. Interestingly, 3 child families have remained the same.
Interesting. What you noted there about the countries where you're seeing higher fertility rates being poor on average, I'm wondering if you saw anything about this, and if you didn't, that's fine. Maybe this wasn't something that you looked at all in researching this. But if you were to go back to 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, at a time where people were having a lot more children, but there was also a much higher likelihood of children dying.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's any kind of a correlation that may exist there, that in the places in the world where perhaps we might expect, given the level of poverty, lack of technological advancement, lack of modern medicine being as readily available, higher infant and child mortality being associated at all with those higher birth rates in those kinds of countries.
I didn't specifically look into that, but I think that that's a pretty safe bet that it is part of it. And also the fact that, because a big part of why people, because as we said earlier, this has been going on for a long time. This isn't just, the past 20 or 30 years. This isn't just since the baby boom. This has been, the baby boom was sort of an anomaly, but it was actually in motion 50, 60 years before that. Actually, since in the United States, since the 1700s, you see this, perpetual decline in fertility down from 7 to 5 and so on. And, it comes in terms of 2 things. Like you said, one, people used to have a lot of children because a lot of them unfortunately died very young or died in, being born. And also they were economically productive. When you had a big family farm or something, you needed a lot of children to work it. And, the more children you had, the more output you could do. When suddenly children went from sort of being, a net gain to your finances and to your family's economic situation to some, to a strain on that situation, people had fewer children or felt the need to, they didn't need to have these children to work on their farms or things like that. So I think that makes sense what you said with parts of the world where, there's still a very high child mortality rate, and also parts of the world that are still more agrarian or, more based on things where having more children could be an advantage economically that we probably is part of why we see higher rates there too.
Again, noting that this is a trend that's been going on for quite a while, It does feel, though, like the concern over it is of rather recent vintage. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that the concern about human population around the world that we were talking about was the population bomb and overpopulation being one of the biggest concerns. And again, that against the backdrop of perhaps the peaks and valleys of the timeline, but again, with the overall trajectory being downward. Why do you think the nature of the conversation has changed, that we've gone from being concerned about the theoretical problems of overpopulation, to now being very concerned about replacement level fertility and underpopulation for a whole lot of reasons that you lay out in your essay?
Yeah, I think part is that we just reached a tipping point, as concerns about overpopulation were already decreasing for various reasons. We realized that we had, better farming, better able to feed all these people, things like that. As that was happening, fertility kept declining, and it wasn't just going from 5 down to 3 down to 2. It was, going now. It's in some countries. I think it's South Korea. It's like 0.81. In a few countries, it's right around 1. In the United States, it's 1.6, and that's what we're seeing in a lot of countries around Europe, is somewhere in the 1.4 to 1.7 range. So it's gone, quite a bit now below replacement fertility, and I think that's what started to freak people out, because when you get to that point, when people talk about this, obviously there are some people who are just like, we need to make more babies because babies are good, families are good, and we want that. But a lot of times when people are talking about this, what they're really talking about is population decline. And they don't want to have population decline because with that can come a lot of things, lowered productivity, perhaps economic stagnation or less innovation. The big one being, fewer people to support pension systems like, Medicare and Social Security here, or things like that. So a lot of these fears are driven by this feeling that, oh no, we keep declining. And if we keep declining even more, pretty soon we're going to see population decline overall. And that's going to create all these other problems.
I can't help from observing there that there's clearly an element to some of the panic over the decline in how many children we're having being connected to what you pointed out. There's the sustainability of a lot of social welfare state kind of spending. So on this, it's just a perfect example of how government operates sometimes, that on one hand, you have an unsustainable system in things like Social Security and Medicaid. And on the other hand, you have new government policies, and I want to get into those in a moment here, what other governments are doing to try to up the birth rates to be able to support the otherwise unsustainable and still, frankly, unsustainable systems like Social Security and Medicaid.
Yeah, it's kind of perverse, isn't it? That, you have these kind of huge push to make people have more babies solely so that they can support an unsustainable social welfare system. Which is why, some of the people that I talked to, some of the academics that I talked to were like, look, what we need to do is stop concentrating on just make more babies, because as I'm sure we'll get to in a second, a lot of these pro-natalist policies don't really work anyways. But we need to start looking at fixing the problems, the underlying problems, so if the problem is that we have these unsustainable old age pension programs and things like that, we need to fix those programs instead of trying to do this proxy thing of getting people to have more babies. Because frankly, those programs are unsustainable right now. Even if we started, having a huge increase in the birth rate right now, they're already facing a lot of strain because we've already got the baby boom population being so large. We've already had declining fertility. So we already don't have enough people to sustain them in anything like a manner that isn't going to be brutal for younger people.
And for somebody on the side of the argument who thinks that it's just a good thing to have more kids and more people, and it makes it a more interesting world, it would also get us out of this argument that is a much more utilitarian argument that more people should be having more kids in order to support these government systems that, as you pointed out, aren't sustainable on their current trajectories. You laid out a couple of examples early on in the essay of what countries are doing. South Korea, for example, Japan, Singapore. Give us some examples of what these countries are doing to try to encourage people to have more children and the success or lack of success that they are seeing with those policies.
Yeah, so I think Singapore is a really good, interesting example because they've just been doing a ton. They actually were discouraging people for a few decades from having more than one children, and then they realized that they really needed to change that because they were having a rapidly declining population. So then they really, for the past several decades, been going all in on trying to get people to have more babies. These days, they offer $8,000 for a first or second baby and $10,000 for every kid thereafter. They raised that for up a couple $1,000s per child from just a few years back. They offer tax rebates to parents. They offer 16 weeks of government mandated paid maternity leave for married mothers. They give housing subsidies to parents. They give parents, because the state sort of places people in housing and schools. So they give parents who have kids and then who have more kids certain priorities in determining where they can live and what schools they can go to if they have more children. They give grandparents subsidies to move near their families, hoping that will help with childcare and things like that. They give these child development accounts that the government puts money into savings for the kids. And so that's been going on for the past, several decades. And in 1990, their fertility rate was 1.8, and now it's around 1.1 or 1.2 the past few years. So even with all of that being done, they still haven't been able to raise fertility rates or stop them from declining even. And those are the same sort of policies you see in a lot of places, offering different amounts of money for children. I think Singapore is one of the most, which is why I brought that up. But you will see various kinds of direct sort of payments to parents. You will see obviously things like child tax credits. You will see some weirder, sort of more symbolic things, like Russia gives people a day or two off per year to make babies. And it's like, take time off work and get to making babies day. You see a lot of then the social welfare policies too, like especially in various European countries and Nordic countries, you see, increasingly long maternity leaves being offered. Now you see more mandatory paternity leave too being offered. You see subsidized childcare and things like that.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting that there seems to be generally two different natured policies, ones that are for the benefit of the child, ones that are for the benefit of the parents of the child, and really neither seem to be all that effective. I mean, one of the lines in your essay that I highlighted, policy reforms in Norway in the late 1980s and early 1990s that substantially expanded paid maternity leave had no discernible effect on fertility rates. So it's like it doesn't seem to matter whether the policies are targeted towards benefits for the children themselves or benefits for the parents or both. They just all – is it the case that they're all just generally seem to be pretty ineffective?
Yeah, I mean that's basically what the research has found overall. There are, there are things like it'll find that they can change the timing of births. Certain policies might cause people to have their kids a few years earlier, but they found that it doesn't tend to increase the overall number of births. I guess the only thing we could say that is kind of unknowable is if some of these places hadn't done these policies, would they be looking at even more drastic declining birth rates? And I guess, that is possible. But it hasn't in any of the countries that have really going all in on them, stopped them from still declining quite a bit since the 90s.
You certainly can't prove the counterfactual. Is there anything out there that you've seen that, I get it at best when we're talking about the outcomes of policies like this, we're talking about correlation because being able to establish actual causation between the policy and the result. Is there any place out there, though, that is at least pointing towards some kind of a correlation between the policies that they're engaging in trying to promote people having more kids with a result of an uptick in the birth rate?
Not really. not that I came across.
One of the things that you pointed out in there, too, is about we were just talking about as well, the evolution of technology and the kinds of things that make it easier for people to take time to themselves in order to have kids and raise kids. There was something really interesting in there about the amount of time people spend parenting now versus the amount of time that they used to spend parenting when birth rates were higher. I'm curious for your thoughts on that. Why do you think that we're seeing this correlation now to, I thought about it in terms of technological advancement, that there are so many different things that you would otherwise have to attend to. Like use the Roomba as an example, right? You don't even have to spend 15 minutes vacuuming your house. You can just turn the Roomba on. We've had a lot of stuff like that taken off of our plates as adults, and it seems to be that we're pouring more of that time into our children. Tell us more about what you found there, and how do you interpret that?
Yeah, there's a bunch of data sort of showing the same thing. I think, one of the study I mentioned is there's a 2016 study that the average mother in 1965 spent half as much time on childcare. And now the average dad does quadruple the time of childcare as they would have in 1965. So yeah, we're seeing a lot more time spent on childcare for both moms and dads. With dads, I think that's more we can say that, the average dad was not spending a lot of time because we had a lot more one parent households and stuff like that. And there was also just not this cultural expectation that dads do as much childcare. But in general, I think we can look at technology, like you said. Moms used to have to spend a lot more time on housework because there was not, there were not all these options. You had to spend a lot more time on cooking and cleaning and things like that because there were not all these different, easy to eat alternatives to home cooked meals or doing everything from scratch. But I think also there are probably just explanations that, yeah, people like spending time with their kids, hopefully. And as you free people from all these sort of things like, having to spend all this more time on house care and things like that, people want to spend time with their kids more often. And I think that, it's one of the many things, as I tried to point out throughout this article, I don't think it's all bad when we look at some of the trends in modern parenting. And I don't think it's all bad when we look at the fact that fertility has declined or birth rates have declined because within there's lots of small nuggets of good news like that. And I think, a lot of times you'll have people point to these sorts of things showing that people spend more on childcare today, and they see that as a negative, and they'll say like, well, no wonder we're having fewer kids. It takes so much more effort to raise kids today. And you're like, I don't think it's clear that that's the way it's cutting, that people are having fewer kids because it's taking more time. I think people are investing more in their kids because they have fewer kids. And so they don't, they're allowed to invest more in each kid. And because they have less time being spent on these other things, like other sorts of household drudgery. And instead, they actually get to spend more time with their children.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that the availability of more time hasn't necessarily led to a desire to have more kids, which I think it perhaps is an interesting commentary on the way we could perhaps tie this back to the phenomenons of things like helicopter parenting. Because, going back to like 1965 and even, I was born in 1982 and recall, I'm sure your childhood was probably similar in this respect of like, recall the just being kind of let out of the house at certain points in time to go do your own thing and to come back. And the concern over the well-being of kids and parents monitoring it so meticulously has increased. And it always reminds me of the reality that the world is a much less dangerous place now than it was in 1965. But the perception certainly seems to be that the world has gotten more dangerous. People are more scared about the things that could potentially happen to their kids if they're left unsupervised, even though if you actually look at the data, it's far less likely that something like that is going to befall them. And if something like that does happen, in almost all of those cases, it is not the bad, Lifetime movie style story where it is just some random person has abducted a child. It's somebody often connected to the family. So I think that's something interesting playing out in the background as well.
100%. I've had this conversation with my parents like about a year ago or something. We were sitting in and they were talking just, about that they're both peak boomers, middle boomers, and they're talking about how much safer the world was when they were young, and how it just seems like there's all these murders now, and it wasn't like that when they were young, or even when they were in high school. So we just, my husband and I just pulled up some stats on murders in Cincinnati where we live, and it's drastically lower now than it was at any point in their childhood or their teenage years. And so it is just amazing how much the reality of situations like that don't align with people's perceptions.
And how much I think it's affected by technology, the rapidity of information, and social media. This has been one of my observations about social media for quite a while, is that it makes things that are thousands of miles away feel like they're happening in your backyard.
Right. About everything that's happening bad in your city and in cities around the world. And it feels like this constant onslaught. Whereas before, you just didn't hear about it. People were blissfully unaware when things were much worse in terms of crime.
I want to return to some of the things, cultural changes that we've experienced over the period of time that you're documenting here that probably influence this. What impact do you think the entry of women into the workforce had on the overall trajectory of the number of kids that we're having? And what impact do you think the advent of the sexual revolution had on the number of kids that we're having?
So the question about women entering the workforce is really interesting because on the one hand, you see the fertility rates that came since the post-baby boom era really start as more and more women entered the workforce in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And so it's kind of like, okay, case closed, right? Like it must be because women are working more. But there's also a lot of interesting tidbits that sort of challenge that idea, because then, as more women entered the workforce in the 90s and early 2000s, in the United States at least, the birth rate ticked back up a while. And then as labor force participation went back down in starting in the mid-aughts, you had the birth rate start dropping really low. In Europe, there was a study of all these different countries, and it looked at women's entry into the workforce between the 60s and the 90s, and it found that in countries where women's workforce participation was the lowest, a lot of them actually had the steepest declines in fertility and now had the lowest birth rates, places like Italy and Spain. In some countries where you had the highest women's workforce participation, you actually had birth rates stay much more stable. So there's actually not as much of a one-to-one correlation between women entering the workforce and lower fertility rates as you might expect. And I think that part of the reason we think that definitely is because there was a really steep drop in the 70s, especially in fertility rates, and that did coincide with a ton of women entering the workforce. I think maybe there was something about going into the workforce back then that required women to feel like they needed to not have children or have fewer children. But I think we sort of started to reverse that a little bit. There are various signs. I mean, there's things like people that used to get advanced degrees would have many fewer children, and they still have fewer children than their counterparts that don't. But it's going back up. People who have master's degrees and PhDs even are now starting to have more and more children. So I think we're starting to see a sort of, over the past few decades, a reverse in this, feeling that women couldn't be, go get a lot of education or be entering the workforce and still have, any kids or more than one kid. The other part, though, the sexual revolution, I mean, if we're talking about just in terms of like the pill and things like that, birth, or all sorts of birth control methods being available, I think that's a much more convincing explanation, because, this does all coincide with easier access to birth control as well. And I think that has made a huge difference. The fact that it allows people to even, to avoid parenthood altogether, or to time their families in a certain way. We see a lot of people that still do become mothers, especially in the millennial generation. A lot of people are becoming mothers later in life, and so they're able to actually, avoid motherhood throughout their 20s and start having kids in their 30s, and that wouldn't have been possible if they, were planning on having sex at all back in the mid-century.
and given the amount of time, or the age at which childbearing becomes, the risk of complications from childbearing becomes more pronounced. The delay in marriage, the delay in childbearing would then push people up against that, I guess, the limits of the age where it starts becoming, the risks start becoming more pronounced.
Well, that's so one of the big things, yeah, is that we are seeing, over the past, another of the good news things is that part of the decline is that we've just seen such a massive drop in teen pregnancy since the 90s. So that's, very, very, and even just going further back, we've seen an even more massive drop since, the 60s and 70s. So that's part of the good news. We've also, though, seen, a decline in women in their 20s having kids. And at the same time, we've seen an increase in women in their 30s and even women in their 40s having kids. Birth rates for those cohorts have gone up amongst the millennial generation. So, for a while, people thought maybe it was just millennial women were timing their fertility different, and that they actually would catch up to earlier generations in terms of fertility rates. But while there has been some of that, it hasn't been enough to, totally offset the decline, because as you said, as people, a lot of times people are having kids, but then they're still not able to have, 4 or 5 or kids, if they're not starting until their 30s. But you are seeing a lot more women that are older having babies. That is one increasing spot in U.S. birth rates.
There's a couple of things that I want to focus in on there. Let's start first with, we can be a little bit self-diagnosing here since we're both millennials, and to be hyper-specific about it, I'm told we're elderly millennials, and I have a bone to pick with whoever coined that terminology for us, but that is neither here nor there.
See, I think it's elder millennial. We're just the eldest of the millennials. Not elderly.
I read it as elderly millennial, and I'll have to go back and double check that, but maybe I was just so induced into rage by somebody's typo or autocorrect problem that it stuck with me. Why do you think that people who fall within our generational cohort, and my whole spiel aside about how generational cohorts as ways of talking about these things are generally dumb and unhelpful, we have seen those delays. People who are getting, really starting with our millennial generation, getting married later, having kids later. Is there any literature, any research that's been done that offers any explanations for why it was, people like us born in the early to mid 1980s that started this trend of pushing all this stuff off to later in life?
So I talked to this demographer, Philip Levine from Wellesley University, and he's looked at a lot of the research on that and done a lot of stuff on this. And he said that this is kind of tangential to your point, but he pointed out that a lot of times birth rates really started to decline during the Great Recession and have not picked up since then, after having been increasing for a little bit. So a lot of times people think like, oh, it must have been the Great Recession, but the effects kept going way past when you would think, that would be the effect. And they were also bigger than that would explain on its own. So people have come up with all these different explanations for why, 2007 or around that time was some sort of breaking point. What happened at that point in time or within those few years after that must have convinced people not to have as many children. And he thinks that we're looking at it wrong, and we should stop looking at something that happened then, and we should be looking further back and looking at, the cohort of people who were coming of age, because in 2007 was right when millennials reached, what traditionally was the start of sort of, or, peak childbearing years. So actually it's, he says it's something bigger about this cohort's decisions around how to time their major life events and things like that. And you can look at all these different explanations people have, like, oh, it must be housing prices going up during this time, or it must be, just all these different things. And if you look at them, it just, none of those really checks out. So it definitely is something about, our generation's sort of general lifestyle, lifetiming decisions. As far as what those are, I mean, I think I don't know. And if he didn't have an explanation either, I think that, you can point to a lot of different things. You can probably point to, the fact that we place more pressure on people to start, to start their careers, to get their educations and start their careers before they start, thinking about marriage and children, much more so than we did in earlier generations. You can maybe say that for later Gen Xers and earlier millennials, that a lot of them were the products of sort of, the big divorce boom in the 70s and 80s. And a lot of them might have been products of broken homes, or a lot of them might have seen their mothers, who were the first generation of, women really entering the workforce and trying to have kids at the same time, might have seen their mothers struggling a lot with it because it wasn't, as, I'm not saying it's easy still, but I think it was harder back then. So maybe there's something about people watching, their mothers seem miserable with having a lot of children and trying to work at the same time. I think you can, just the way we treat adolescents, we keep extending adolescence from teenage years up into the 20s and stuff. So we act like, young adults are children for a lot longer, which kind of, I think, doesn't, make them feel like they're too young to get married and have kids. I think, just a lot of different things that you could point to as plausible explanations for why.
I always feel inclined myself to be somewhat dismissive of the narrative that's put together of how millennials have endured these different exogenous shocks over their kind of young adult lives. So, I was a sophomore in college when 9/11 happens, and then I'm a couple years into my post-college career when the Great Recession happens. And, then when you're coming up on, let's put 40 as a cap on that, kind of right before that point in time where you're getting, out of that kind of beginning of your life and career where you're establishing a family and having kids, we have a global pandemic. So on one hand, I'm always suspicious of those grand narrative kind of explanations for problems like this, but I also just don't find myself, having lived through it, entirely capable of dismissing the impact that that kind of, again, over 20 years, rapid succession of events, quote unquote, had on people in our generation and the decisions on their lives that they made as a result of those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think, it's probably not any one thing or any two or three things. I think that there's probably so many different factors that have shifted our decision making. One other one, there's a lot of negative ways people look at relationship formation nowadays and think, people are waiting too long to get married and things like that. But you couldn't say in a positive way that, we're much more likely than earlier generations also to feel like we don't have to be paired up, or we don't have to be married, and when we do get married, we want to make sure that it's to the right person, and we want to make sure that it's for the right reasons. And so maybe people are much less likely to get married just because they think like, oh, I'm getting older, I need to get married, I need to have kids and things like that. I am 40 right now. I am pregnant with my second child. I had my first one in 2021. So I'm definitely on this, millennial later pregnancy, later child rearing trajectory. And for me, I just speak to my own personal situations. It's just, I didn't get married till I was 35. I just didn't meet a person who was, I wanted to marry until later in life. It wasn't, you hear a lot about like, oh, they're millennials just don't realize that they have, that their fertility declines with age, or they're just too invested in their careers. But I think that there's, sure, that's some people, but I think that that's a little bit overblown. And a lot of times it's just people would have children earlier, but, their life circumstances just don't allow it. So,
that seems to be a cultural rub, right? So it's like if we have moved away from a culture that largely inculcates into people that one of those things that you do earlier on in life to begin establishing yourself is to find someone, get married, and start having kids, to one that I think does change that, that puts you start developing your career and your job prospects and all of that, education and then career and then family first. So there does seem to be to kind of borrow from, I guess, like the Brookings success sequence kind of way of looking at this, the sequence of events that used to take place does seem to have been shuffled around.
Yes, definitely.
One other thing I wanted to get your thoughts on, I've seen data that suggests that there's a gap in between what women report as the number of kids that they would like to have and then the number of kids that they actually do end up having. I'm not an economist. I have a degree in music. I'm just pretending to be one for the purpose of this conversation. economists' response to that, I believe, would largely be that this is revealed preference, right? So people say they want X, but their actions actually reveal that they want Y. Do you think that's a sufficient explanation for the gap that exists in between what people say? I mean, when it comes to a lot of economic interactions, I'm perfectly on board with the revealed preference being a good explanation of all of this. But I don't know, there's something about childbearing and child rearing that just like seems to be markedly different. You could have those kids, rather easily if you wanted to, and people are clearly choosing not to, despite stating a desire to have more than they're actually having. What if any, insights do you have on what we're seeing there?
Yeah. So first, just to put this in perspective, we still see people, even in I think I talked to a woman who measured Gen Xers and millennials, and still right around 2 is the what people say is the ideal number of children, or their intended number of children, and we're not up to that because we're at 1.6 is our fertility rate. So it's not a huge gap, but there is a gap. The ideal fertility rate has declined over time. So there is definitely, it has gone down as actual fertility has gone down. And Scott Winship at AEI, he joined us for a conversation with Reason TV recently, and he's actually he's looked at a lot of data that maybe challenges the idea that people are having way fewer kids than they want to have. But if we look at, yes, there is a lot of, if we just look at what people say versus the 1.6 fertility rate, we can see that. And I think we can look at, yes, this as a revealed preference thing, because two things I think we should really do is, when you ask someone about ideal fertility, sometimes that's not the same as saying how many kids do you want to have or do you plan to have? People may mean different things by that. They may think, oh, the ideal family is 2, but they don't, or whatever, 4, but they don't really think that they're going to be that. But even when, people are saying that it's their intended plan, these surveys tend to be asked of people that are, in their from the 18 into their mid-20s range. A lot of these are done with younger people. So I think we can say, that 18-year-olds, 22-year-olds, 25-year-olds even are not always the best judge of what they will want as their life goes by. So I don't think we should put total stock in the idea that, because someone said when they were 22 that they wanted to have 4 kids, then they only had 2 kids, that means that they're thwarted in their fertility goals. Because, a lot happens. You might have 2 kids and then realize, I love just having 2 children. I have enough time for them. I have enough money for them. I don't want to have more because I'm happy with the number of children I have. You might realize this is a lot harder than I thought it would be. And I don't have the resources, emotional or financial, to have more children. You might realize that actually I'm really fulfilled in my career, or I really like traveling. And so I thought I wanted to have this many children, but a bigger family would make that much harder to do. And I actually now prioritize these other things as life goes on. So I'm very convinced that, asking people when they're very young how many kids they want is not, the best indicator of their true desires in some way. I think that the revealed preferences definitely are at play here, because so much changes. And we don't sort of believe that whatever, people that are in their early 20s say about what they want to do for their career, tons of people change careers, and we're not worried that they're being all thwarted in their life ambitions. So I just think I think it's sort of the same thing when it comes to this.
Before we move on, I do want to go back real quick to one of the countries that we didn't talk about, because it comes up frequently in conversations that we have here at the Acton Institute as we've looked at the rise of the so-called new right, and that is constantly referencing Hungary as an example and a model that should be followed. This is one of the areas that I often hear Hungary referenced as a supposed template for us here in the United States. What is or has Hungary been doing, and what, if any, success have they been seeing there?
I am not sure precisely what Hungary has been doing. I didn't look closely at their different things. I know that they've had a lot of the same sort of economic programs and sort of cultural propaganda aimed at parents as a lot of countries who are really trying hard to raise birth rates have. And just they're on par with the United States birth rate. I think theirs was right around 1.6 also in 2020. So for all of this, they have not, drastically increased their birth rates either.
So as we kind of come to the conclusion here, the final two sections of your essay are subheaded Keep Calm and Start Adapting and Don't Panic, which I think the latter is always pretty good advice. But the question is, how much should we be concerned about this trend? As we noted at the beginning of the conversation, there are a lot of different reasons why people are concerned about this. You have advocates for more families and more kids just being a good in and of itself. You do have people who are concerned from the economic and the sustaining of government programs perspective on all of this, caring for an older population just in general, but also the financial costs of caring for an older population. So this is one of those topics that there is a lot of panic about. So I guess we'll kind of come to a conclusion here. I'll start by asking how big of a problem do you really think this is, and how concerned should we be about it? And then we'll get into the what, if anything, do you think can be done to address it, the declining birth rates as an issue?
So this might just be my general sort of disposition is to not, be very panicky or concerned about the big changes that everyone is like, oh my God, this is going to spell the end of everything. Because I tend to think that, we figure out how to adapt and things like that. So my answer is that I am not terribly concerned. As I said, I don't think we're looking at a situation where people are being massively thwarted in their fertility goals, which would be a cause for concern. If women are just not able to have, the children they want, I think that would, not a cause for government intervention, but it would be a cause for concern. But I don't think that there's actually, that much data to support that. I don't think that there's a lot of data suggesting that people are all out there wanting to have more kids and the economics of the situation are preventing it. I just think a lot of these roadblocks that might be concerning don't seem to actually exist. So what we're looking at then is people are choosing to have the amount of kids that they're having. And I don't think that is a reason for concern. I think that's actually kind of, a good thing. It's a positive idea that people are able to control the amount of children that they have and limit the amount of children that they have. And as we said earlier, this isn't a situation where we're seeing, drastic increases in people having zero kids. It's just people having smaller families. People want to have smaller families so they feel like they can invest more time in each children and invest more resources in each children. Again, that could very well be looked at as a good thing too. So I think there's just like a lot of ways that you look at the situation, leaving aside the population decline potential for a moment. I think there's just a lot of ways that you look at the situation and say, oh, people are choosing to have smaller families. That is very good. It's a sign of, freedom. It's a sign of progress, economic progress. It's a sign of people being able to, choose their own destinies better and things like that. As far as if we should be worried about population decline, I don't think we're there yet. And there's definitely a lot of things we can do to stave that off, especially in a country like the United States, which has historically been very, very open to immigration. And so, one of the best ways we go about if we're worried about, Native-born Americans not producing enough children to get us to replacement level fertility, we let more immigrants in. So that's one big thing. And also there are things that might surprise us, as you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, we were all very freaked out, in the 20th century about overpopulation and how, the world, it was going to cause this mass starvation and all this stuff. You had all this doomsaying about all the things that were going to happen. And it turned out for lots of different reasons that was not the case. And I think that, that we're likely to see that here. There's a lot of things. I don't think we're going to see suddenly, going back to a ton of, 4 and 5 children families. But I think that there's an indication that we may reach a plateau of where we're just going to be at our fertility rates. And also there are things that could, change it. As I mentioned in the article, technology could play a difference. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who want to have children nowadays who are unable to. I know it seems like a ton of people, and not necessarily all older women who, just of all ages, who are going through IVF because they've had fertility issues. And so that's helped a lot of people, but that's still, prohibitively expensive for a lot of families. So as that technology gets better, as other sorts of technologies get better, we may see more and more people who want to become parents and aren't currently able to be able to. That was a lot of answer to that question. Sorry, that was kind of all over the place, but.
Elizabeth Nolan Brown is a senior editor at Reason and the main author of Reason's morning newsletter, The Reason Roundup. She's the author of the cover story in the June 2023 issue of Reason magazine, Storks Don't Take Orders from the State, Falling Birth Rates, Pro-Natalist Policies, and the Limits of Population Control, which we've been discussing today. Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us today on Act in Line.
Thank you for having me.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Act in Line, I'm Eric Cohn.